Hi class, welcome to Psychology 1. I'm your professor. You can call me Professor Chhun, Instructor Chhun. Either way, I don't have my doctorate, so you can't call me Dr. Chhun. I have my master's. It would be kind of weird for you to call me Master Chhun though. So either of the first ones, Professor Chhun, Instructor Chhun, works. Let's get started with the introduction to psychology so that you can get an idea of what you're really getting into. All right, the main question that used to be a hot topic is psychology in the field of science? And a lot of people used to argue, no, that's a fake science, or it's not really science because it's people who are just reading other people, but there is a science behind it, and because of that, psychology is in the field that is usually categorized as a soft science. So soft meaning it's, there's still a lot of theory in place, but it's not one of the hard sciences. Examples would be chemistry, biology, engineering, those types of sciences. Let's talk more about how psychology is a science. Okay, so this is from like my actual face-to-face classes. We're always going to have an agenda, which is going to be comprised of our learning objectives. So from 1 through 1.12, these actually follow your books, so I'm not going to talk about them in order to save time. We will start with talking about some of the early pioneers in psychology. Okay, so psychology has a very specific definition, and you'll see as we go through this class, whenever we have a key term or whenever we're talking about a specific keyword, we're looking at the specific definition of it. So psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So the reason it says, I want to point, because usually in the classroom I point to the board in order to show you, but I can't do that. I'm pretty sure I'm like in a little box in the corner right now. But right, so psychology, we're talking about scientific study because science uses steps. We use the scientific method. If you remember from middle school, even elementary school or high school, that's the process that we go by, right? You may have learned the 8-step method or the 5-step method. Either way, we go through specific steps in order to make sure that this is something that we can really validate and say, look, we followed these steps, and it's not just us thinking or us imagining that our truth is the truth. Behavior, I shortened this by saying BX, and anytime you're taking notes in psychology, BX is always going to stand for behavior if you want to save yourself some time and save yourself some of that, physical writing. So behavior is an outward or overt action and reaction. This means it's anything that you can see somebody doing, right? Or that you yourself are doing. If you are blinking, that's a behavior. If you're walking, if you are talking, no, that's not right. I was gonna say something that's a mental process, but even if you are sleeping, that's a behavior, right? Mental processes is the other part that is related in order to make psychology this full definition, right? So mental processes are internal. They are covert activities of our minds. So covert means that it's kind of hidden, right? So if you're thinking of covert agents, you're thinking of pretty much spies, right? People who you can't outwardly tell what their job is as a spy because they are undercover. So that's what a mental process is. It is thinking, it's remembering, it is emotions, right? Those types of things are mental processes. Psychology is the scientific study of both behavior and mental processes. All right, let's talk about a few influential people. These people are not in your book, but I wanted to add them in because I do think that psychology does have its roots in way farther back than when anybody ever coined the word psychology. So you'll see that these influential people are not actually psychologists, and that's okay. So A few of these influential people are Aristotle, who is, your book is different. All right, let me just put that as a caveat. Your book says someone else is the father of psychology. In lecture, and according to me, Aristotle is the father of psychology. Now, he's not known as a psychologist, he's more known as a philosopher, which is still right, because he didn't actually put these thoughts into scientific testing, right? So, yes, he's a philosopher, but I consider him the father of psychology because he is the first one who is documented to actually start thinking about human behavior and mental processes, right? He said that the connection between psychological processes and the underlying physiological phenomenon is what psychology is, and that is the study of the essence of life, right? There's one thing that's a problem with this. The problem is that the study of the essence of life is such a broad term, right? The essence of life. That's a lot of stuff. So really, he was just kind of thinking about that, which is great, and we didn't have a jump towards more current psychology, the way that we use psychology today, until about the 1600s, when René Descartes, a French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist, said that, wait a minute, humans are partly mechanic and they're also partly ruled by a soul. If you're thinking about the time and place that these people lived, it is way different than our modern society, but he was onto something. And when we talk about biological psychology in chapter 2, you're going to see how humans are actually kind of partly mechanic. We're also partly ruled by a soul. So Descartes lived in the 1600s in French court. French court was where the aristocrats and nobility lived, and during this time, you'd actually be surprised, but if you were walking around during this time, you would see that French court was kind of like Disneyland, right? They had great animated types of machinery that would walk and mimic the behaviors of actual animals, of people, and Descartes looked at these animals and said, and people, dolls and figures, and said, what is the difference between somebody who is human and something that is a doll that looks human? Because those dolls would be mechanic, right? And the difference was that humans and animals are partly ruled by a soul. So that's all we're going to talk about with Descartes. We're going to go on to the next person, which is John Locke. Oh, actually, I have a picture of Descartes. Ta-da! Okay, so I don't know if he looks familiar to you, but if you're around like my age, or maybe you like older movies, doesn't that look like Sylvester Stallone? Right? Rocky? Rambo? He kind of looks like it. Anyways, okay, so let's move on. So John Locke is actually another philosopher. Maybe you've had a philosophy class before, or you've heard of his name because of different types of majors that you're in. John Locke is partially famous for his idea of tabula rasa, so blank slate. Usually in class face-to-face, I have you guys, we get into a little discussion, but since we don't have that, I'm just going to explain it. So in these times, again, in the 1600s, and even up until fairly recently in history, I'm talking 1800s, even beginning of the 1900s, people thought that the way that you were born is predetermined, right? Not the way that you were born, but who you turned out to be was predetermined. And Locke said, wait a minute. When a person is born, they are this baby, and this baby is a blank slate, meaning the environment and nurture and the way that you treat this child is going to determine the outcome of their life, right? We used to think that if you were a great person, it's because you were born a good apple. If you were not a good person, it's because you were born a bad apple, right? And John Locke says, no, no, no. And this was huge in this time because people just thought, oh, if that person ended up, in prison, it's because they were born a bad apple. And that is where John Locke says, wait, environment plays a huge role. So we'll talk more about that in development and actually partially in biological psychology, so hang on to that. But again, that is actually a big part of psychology, right? Seeing how environment and genetics play a role in the way we behave and the way that we think and mental processes. Okay, so this is where your book does start off with historical figures, and there are a lot of important historical figures, but in order to save time order, I can't talk about all of them. So we're going to talk about a few of the ones that are in your book right now. Wilhelm Wundt, right? If some of you speak German or know how to pronounce this correctly, I think I'm doing it right? Wilhelm Wundt. Okay, so in your book, and if you Google, this is the person that is actually known as the father of psychology. So he's known as the father of psychology, and it is true because he was the first one to really put the scientific method behind the theories. So where he did this was in his laboratory that was called the first formal psychology lab. This was in Germany in 1879. The way that he wanted to study the human mind was by analyzing the content of one's mind through what he calls objective introspection. So if you were sitting in his laboratory, in his classroom, if you were a student of his, he would say, actually, he would give you an object. He would give you a rock or an apple, say objective introspection, and he would say, what is it? Now, because he's German, right? So if we're talking about being objective, this means what can we clearly measure? What can we see? It doesn't have to do with our feelings, but what is it that we can actually tell by using our observations about this object, right? So if he gave you a rock, he would say, you would hold it and he would say, what is it? And he would ask you to really give him descriptive words about what makes this a rock, right? So you might say, it's minerals, it's tough, it's hard, it's solid, it's smooth, or it's rocky, or whatever it may be. And he would gather all of these words from everybody who had a rock and compartmentalize the structure to say, hey, in order to be a rock, it has to be all of these things that you said it had in common. Same with an apple. What is it, right? And you would say, oh, it's food, it is a fruit, it is red, green, yellow, whatever it is, right? And it has to have all those parts in order to be considered an apple, right? It has seeds. I don't know if 5 is exact, but it has these seeds and it has a stem and it has, when we're talking about an apple like that, he would say, in order to be an apple, it has to have all these different compartments to be an apple. I always forget about these. Okay, so part of what makes us human is we have to have thought, we have to have experience, we have to have emotion, but they were in different compartments. He didn't really think of it as being all integrated as one, which we'll talk about coming up. All right, so Titchener was a student of Wundt's, and he was in that laboratory where he was studying the structures of the mind. He wanted to further that. So instead of just looking at objects, he really wanted to look at emotions and sensations. So tell me about things that are blue, right? How does that make you feel? How do you experience that? And after he finished studying with Wundt, he came over to America and brought this idea of structuralism with him. So this is the first type of psychology, and it's called structuralism. How we compartmentalize or put experiences or things into a structure in order for it to be that object, in order for us to experience it. Next, we have Margaret Washburn, and Washburn was Titchener's student in America, right? So she was actually the first woman to receive a PhD in psychology. However, she wasn't actually supposed to be. When she was studying under Titchener over at Columbia, That's where he taught. That's where he, after he left Germany, he came to teach at Columbia, and she was a pupil of his. He said, there's no way that Columbia is going to grant you a PhD. They don't grant women PhDs, so you're gonna I have a connection over at Cornell. You can go there, study, and you can get your doctorate there. And so she did, and she actually received her PhD and is now known as the first woman to have her PhD in psychology. However, she also studied structuralism because, of course, she was a pupil of Titchener's, who was a pupil of Wundt's. And after this point in time, structuralism did end up dying out because the way we do psychology today is not by compartmentalizing, which we're going to get into on the next slide. Okay, so the type of psychology we do today is called functionalism. William James, over here in the United States, he founded his laboratory at Harvard in 1875. Now, I don't know if you're paying close attention to dates, but 1875 comes before 1879, right? So 1879 was when Wundt had his first formal psychology lab. And in 1875 is when James founded his lab in America. Wundt founded it in Germany, right? However, he, as in William James, founded, his lab was called functionalism. So he's not really dubbed with having the first psychological laboratory. One, because he calls it functionalism, but two, also because he had gone over to study under Wundt in order to really implement the scientific method into his study. So we still give Wilhelm Wundt credit for being the father of psychology, but James's type of psychology is really the type of psychology that we use today. So he's not so much concerned with what is it, but why. So not what, but why. Not breaking down the mind into different separate structures, but why do we have this perception, right? Why do we perceive things in this way? So usually in class, I would stand in front of you or in front of somebody who was sitting in one of the front rows, and I would draw a 6 onto the floor, right? So let's pretend that I drew a 6 onto the floor. It's flat. To me, it's a 6. But to you, standing across from me, what does that number look like? I hope you said 9 because I can't hear you because I'm recording. So honestly, this is kind of weird for me too. But I would say a 6, you would say a 9. Are either of us wrong? No, right? Both of us are correct, but we came up with a different perception based off of where we are physically, right? This happens mentally as well. So, closer now. So, we're not breaking down the mind into structures, but we're breaking down different perspectives, how we see what we see because of our own experiences, right? Or where we are. So, he really wanted to look at how the mind allows people to adapt, right? So how we change, especially in these days, right? We're always changing, especially in COVID-19 times, just switching up our entire lives, right? How we live, how we work, and how we play. So adults still do all of these things, right? We still play, whether it's sometimes video games, maybe it's board games now that we're at home, whatever play means to you, functioning in real life, IRL. I learned that a few semesters ago. So I try to keep updated. This is why I miss face-to-face interactions because I learn so much from students too. So functioning in real life, functioning in the real world. That's the type of psychology that we do today. All right, so we will very quickly talk about women in psychology, and then we are going to, I'm going to take a break and break this up into separate videos. So, women in psychology, I guess I didn't really need to tell you that because I could have just posted it. That's okay, it's my first time too. So, women in psychology, Hollingworth was the first psychologist to really study child development and women issues. Prior to her field and her studies, people really only looked at studies in colleges, and usually these studies were done on males because that was the population of people who were in college. So children weren't in college, women weren't in college. And actually, during this time, a lot of people thought that children, if you can imagine like your brothers or sisters or your own children or grandchildren who are at home, they just thought that children were miniature adults. So thought the same, perceived the same, but they were just physically not developed into an adult yet. That's mind-boggling, right? So you would see kids doing the same type of work that their parents were doing, whether it was hard labor farming or working in the factory or working with heavy machinery. That's what they would be doing, right? As well as women issues. So Mary Calkins, who also studied with William James at Harvard, when she finished her degree, Harvard said, we do not give doctorates to women, so what you're going to need to do is go over to our sister school and apply for the doctorate there, do everything that you need to do for the doctorate there. She had already done everything for her doctorate at Harvard, and she was like, you know what? No, I'm not going to do this all over again. I already did this. What she did instead is she became the first female president of the APA, and this is a big deal because any psychology department, this includes Harvard, this includes all types of institution, except for psychiatry, there's a different type of APA for that. You have, that basically tells you what you can teach, what you can do at these institutions. So she became the first female president of the American Psychological Association, APA, and was like, check it out, Harvard University, as well as any other university out there. I'm pretty much the president of anything that goes on in your psychology department in your schools. So that's a big FU to Harvard U, right? She studied memory. She really was supposed to be the first woman to have her PhD, but you know that Margaret Washburn actually was a person who got that degree, that doctorate, because Mary Calkins was denied by Harvard. Okay, so the last woman that we talk about, there's many others, is Karen Ornay, and that's how you have to say her name because she would not like it if you mispronounced her name. So she studied social and cultural aspects of psychology. Really important. We're going to talk more about the subfields of psychology coming up. And she was the first feminist psychologist, and she said that Freud was sexist, which if you've heard of Sigmund Freud, she's not wrong. And we'll talk about more of that later. So these women really influenced the modern types of psychology that we do today in the fields of education, industrial organizational psychology. If you've never heard of this before, this is the sellouts of psychology. I know because, and I can say that because I was one, but we'll talk about more of that later.